Joining us now, Charmaine Yoest. She's president of Americans United for Life. Charmaine, thanks for being with us.
Hey, Senator. Thanks for having me. Great to be with you.
Well, we appreciate it. Charmaine, I see where Senator Baucus is now saying that he's going to make sure that in his bill on the Senate side that none of this abortion stuff is going to survive. That they'll make it clear that
that's kind of a poor
that there'll be no coverage for abortion services. What do you think about that?
Well, it's an interesting development because, you and I living in this town for as long as we both have, and you in particular working in the Senate, you know how these things go. People describe things one way, and then they turn out to be another, and then they get into various committee negotiations, and then they turn out to be something entirely different. And frankly, we're a little bit burned after seeing the president stand up last week and say abortion is not going to be funded in this bill, when in actual fact that we know that as things stand right now, the leading contenders for health care reform very definitely do contain an abortion mandate in them. So, I'm very open to this new bill. They're saying that there's an explicit bar on abortion funding, so we're going to take a look at it and see.
Well, you're being very very open-minded, and I think giving people credit that probably they don't deserve. I mean, it is. To me, it's the biggest shell game imaginable, and I apply it to the entire health care bill, not just the abortion provision, because you're exactly right. The process is that the Senate will come up with something, the House will come up with something, they'll go into conference, they'll have a past midnight kind of resolution about some things. That's even after the amendment process and all of that, and then there'll be wiggle room there, and everything is not covered in great detail. So you put it in the hands of the regulators who make 10 pages of regulation for every page of law, and they, in many respects, actually make the law, and on and on and on and on, and ultimately, you have to depend upon the credibility of those that you're dealing with, and they've squandered their credibility.
You're pointing to something really important. Americans United for Life is a legal arm of the pro-life movement. And one of the things that we've been working really hard to help people understand, there's been so much talk about funding in these bills that's where the president is able to say, hey, abortion's not in there. That really misses the point, because we are never going to have a piece of legislation that says in big red letters, abortion here. They're not that stupid. So what instead people need to understand is that the real concern is not so much the funding, it's the mandate that's going to be imposed by courts after the thing gets passed. What we found in the Medicaid bill is after they passed it, the courts came in and said, hey, abortion is a minimum standard of care. So it's looking at the definition of saying that abortion is fundamental health care, which, as we all know, has always been Planned Parenthood's ultimate objective. So the bottom line, here's the bottom line that your listeners have to understand is, unless we see an amendment that explicitly says, proactively says, that there's no abortion funding will be allowed under a federalized healthcare system, then abortion is in there.
Well, didn't members of the House try to do that in the bill that came out of the Help Committee over there?
Well, exactly, and that's why it's so disingenuous when you see situations like the president, like Kathleen Sebelius, saying that it's not in there and that they support banning federal funding for abortion. There have been at least half a dozen amendments, and we've got these listed on our website, where, pro-life heroes in the House and Senate have tried to get an explicit ban on abortion funding into the various bills that are under consideration. So, you really do have to ask if the president, if the leaders who are advocating for health care reform really are sincere about seeing a ban on abortion funding, why have they not supported the, almost dozens of amendments that we've had so far that have made that clear? It's very simple. The amendment doesn't have to be complicated. It just has to say something like what we have in the Hyde Amendment that says none of these funds shall be used to to pay for abortion. It's very simple.
But what you're saying is that as it stands now, the main bill in the House side does allow for the funding of abortions.
Absolutely, because unless there's an explicit exclusion, it will be imposed by the courts.
So when the president said that it was a lie to say that it was in there, I forget exactly what his words were. He was not accurate in that. Or was he parsing words? I mean, I forget exactly what. You have to look at every word he says, because sometimes he's technically correct but leaves the wrong impression, as you know.
Well, exactly. It's a disingenuousness because, like I said, there's not a big red letter, here's abortion, we're going to fund abortion here, because they know they could never get that passed. They're counting on the courts who have said, see, going back, the other side keeps saying, hey, we've got the Hyde Amendment, so you don't need to worry. Let me just quickly outline why we had to have the Hyde Amendment. Right. Was because you had Medicaid, Planned Parenthood immediately takes it to court, and the courts, again and again and again came back and said a mandatory standard of care is abortion. It's included in Medicaid. So historically what happened is pro-life forces came back and said, okay, we'll have the Hyde Amendment that specifically addresses this point, that says you may not use federal funds to subsidize abortion. And it took care of the problem. Well, it's not to be too technical. Yeah. For the most part, it took care of the problem in Medicaid. So that has been a thorn in their side for years. And so to a large degree, this whole healthcare reform agenda is an attempt to create an end run
to get around the Hyde Amendment. Let me ask you one final question. We got about a minute left, Charmaine. You've been on Capitol Hill. You've talked to member after member after member. Do they know what's in this bill? Are they up on this?
Well, I tell you that is a really good question, isn't it? Because it's so complicated. They like to have it both ways. They'll say, well, it's not in the bill, but then you never know which one they're talking about. Yeah. Which plan. That's right. And which variation. So I think we really do have an issue there in terms of nailing them down as exactly what they're talking about.
Well, what about their level of understanding? Are they people have a hard time understanding. They're all things to all people. They're trying to do everything, run the world, and you have these complicated issues and so forth. Are they taking the time to understand any of these variations that they're having to deal with?
Well, I tell you, this is why I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today, is because we've been working really hard to educate people about this question of a mandate. We've heard so much about funding, and frankly, once the courts get involved in saying that abortion is mandatory care, how you set up the funding system becomes largely irrelevant. So we're trying to back up and say, okay, look, funding is a concern, but unless you've got this explicit exclusion, that's when the courts got involved. And frankly, we feel kind of fortunate because we are going to the White House on Thursday to follow up after the president said. Well,
it gets to be very, very technical, but very, very important. And basically, what you're saying is that if you're not precise in what you do here, it leaves all kind of rooms for all kind of politicians to say all kinds of things, and it's hard to pin them down. You got to ask where their heart is, and I think you can look back over the last decade with regard to most of them and tell that pretty readily. Thank you for being with us.